Earlier this year, Crime World released a podcast series called Caught in the Crossfire about the murders of Anthony Campbell and Martin Marlo Highland. Now, during the making of the series, I sat down with retired detective Brian Sherry to discuss the murder investigation. And what you heard throughout the series were snippets of that interview. As a bonus, we're releasing the full interview, so you can watch Brian's full unabridged account of his time working on the case. You can listen to the full series now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Okay, my name is Brian Sherry, and I'm a retired detective inspector. I retired in July 2007. And at that particular time, just before my retirement, I was based in Blanchardstown, and that area was covering Finglas and Cabra and Blanchardstown. And I joined the Guards back in 1971, and I had 36 years service at that time. I decided to retire in 2007, but I had made my mind up in 2006. And shortly after this murder, that made my mind up. It's one of those things
that stayed with you. It just got you.
Most of the murders I had investigated up to that were well-known criminals and everything else like that. Okay, Marlo was a well-known criminal, but young Campbell wasn't.
Yeah.
When I walked into the house that morning, I saw him on the floor with a hole in his head. Mm. And he was lying just under the radiator. That's how the plumber couldn't see him.
Look, people think that guards, that investigators, that journalists, that we've...
We're hard-nosed.
Hard-nosed, and we've seen it all, and it's just...
Well, I was, and I probably still am, if I go to the right scene or something like that. I have seen some horrendous scenes, and I've been in horrendous situations and things like that, and it never affected me. Mm. This one did.
This one did, yeah. And the thing is that when I started talking to Christine, how many murders are there? Each one of them has family and all the trauma.
Oh, yeah.
And the generational trauma that goes with it. But, and been in the media, you're covering this murder, you're covering that murder, all the rest of it. But that one stayed with me. And it was all those elements you describe. I didn't obviously have the nightmare of walking in and seeing that. There was something about his face, the innocence, the smiling child about to become a man.
Yeah.
And the
exactly.
idea that it was a mother's only child and she lost her only child in such...
Oh, it was the cruel...
senseless.
It was really cruel. And she was a lovely woman.
Yeah.
His grandmother and his whole family, Christine's parents, and that. They were all lovely people, and, salt of the earth. It was horrendous.
Horrendous.
And it was one that we all wanted to solve, every one of us. Mm. And we put our backs and bones into it. And I know that, I know because I had a great crew in Blanchardstown and Finglas and Cabra. The murder happened in the Finglas area, but we moved it to Blanchardstown for to carry out the investigation because we had a room out there. When I went out there in 2002, they had a small little room where you had one fella in doing files and that, and within a year we were slaughtered, and they blamed me because of all the trouble that started then, when I arrived there. And so what I did was I got this big room down at the end, and we put it into a completely sole investigation room, manned by 2 people. And I had to take them off my own people. So we were actually down 2 detectives. Mm. But it was, and we fought hard to get them replaced and everything else like that. We couldn't, but you could get in what we used to call buckshees aides and that, and they used to come in, and they were great lads and great girls. In fairness, we managed to do it, but compared to Limerick, we were being slaughtered, and I mean slaughtered. From 2002 until I left in 2007, we were being slaughtered with murders, attempted murders, shootings, everything that you could name, was thrown at us. And we'd only a tiny little unit in Blanchardstown and Finglas. And whereas Limerick was getting everybody.
Didn't it happen so quick then at the beginning of those 2000s? Do you suppose you had...
Yeah, it was like an explosion.
Yeah. And you had that element of, look, there was much more money. You had all those elements that went with it. The economy was booming. We were in full employment.
Exactly.
You had the arrival of cocaine, which changed everything. And
no one got buses. Everyone got taxis.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, the cocaine really hit the streets, with the IT crowd and everyone else, partying and everything else like that. And it became the fashionable thing to have. Everyone was going around with a little bit of it. And, it was fashionable for a party. If you were having a party, that you had a little bit of cocaine to spread around, for people and that. It was crazy. But it played right into the hands of the criminals, of course.
And I suppose
the fortune out of it.
The likes of Marlo Hyland was in prime position there. He was so perfectly placed.
Oh, yeah.
To become what he kind of became. So, when did you become...
Go back if you want.
Let's start with him, Marlo.
Marlo, yeah.
Or do we need to go back to PJ Judge?
Go back further,
Well, you tell me your memories of, when he came into your...
Well, yeah, I can remember PJ Judge in Finglas. He was known as the Psycho. And himself and Marlo were very, very close. PJ Judge was actually going out with a sister of Marlo's. And that's how close they were. And PJ Judge, was sort of the real leader at that particular time. He was the main person who was involved in all the drugs and all of that type of thing. And he was involved in murders as well, at that time. Marlo was sort of his second in command. And they grew up together more or less as criminals. And eventually, PJ Judge was murdered. That was, I think, around 1996. He was murdered in a car park of a pub there in the bottom of the hill there in Finglas. And rumour had it, Marlo was behind it. Marlo set it up. And that he arranged for him to be hit by other gangs. And he was shot dead. And then Marlo was the kingpin then. Mm. And that was from 96 on. And he then started, becoming much bigger. An awful lot of attention started going on him from the guards. He had tentacles which were moving out. You talk about John Gilligan. Marlo was of similar scope.
Ambition?
Ambition is right. Yeah, that's a good word for him, because he was determined that he was going to become the number one criminal in Ireland at that particular time. And he probably got up there very, very high in his heyday. But then, as the years rolled on, it's like everything else. And I always said it, the more you're involved in crime, there's always someone there who wants to pull you down. And number one thing that started happening was a number of his shipments started being caught, found, and fellas arrested with them. And some of his major associates were being arrested in possession of large consignments of drugs. And of course, when that started happening, people thought, okay, we've a rat in our camp. But in reality, I believe what it was surveillance that was being carried out on his crew by the guards, listening in as well, and all that sort of stuff that was going on. But they weren't really aware of that type of sophistication by the guards at that particular time. So the obvious thing was that there was a rat in the camp, and eventually the crew believed that it was Martin himself who was ratting out these guys, because he felt that they were trying to usurp his power.
Right.
Because they were getting powerful as well.
That's called paranoia, when everyone is turning on each other.
That's real paranoia. You saw it then subsequently with Eamon Dunn. Eamon Dunn was your class example of that type of paranoia. And Like, I mean, he was the kingpin then after Marlo, and like that, but he started using his own product, cocaine, and he was going around, and he became totally paranoid, and he was responsible for something like 16, 17 murders. You know, we've seen it all before. It's nothing new. But these were the type of things that we were dealing with from, say, 96, maybe before 96. Obviously before 96, that I would have seen a lot of it. I would go back, like when I was in the Central Detective Unit, which is now the National Bureau of Criminal Investigation. I went in there in 1978. And in my time in there, like, I mean, we were concentrating on the Duns and Martin Cahill and the Cahill gang and all of those type of people, like, I mean, the criminals. And, you know, like, you got to know these people. You got to know everything about them. Like, I mean, you're stopping them, you're searching them, you're sitting on their doorsteps practically, you know. And, like, I mean, we had good success against them as well at times.
Isn't it interesting, because what you've pointed out about Marlo's organisation and later the Don Dunn's organisation, I think the same happens today. You know, you put the pressure on and they implode.
That's right.
There's a dismantling, an organised dismantling by the police. They have a target, but a lot of the time the grouping itself
implodes
or sort of destroys itself.
Waiting in the wings.
Yeah.
And it's strange, like, I mean, but they're getting younger now. Much younger.
They are.
And much more lethal. Like, I mean, you've always remember, go back to, which of the Duns was it? Larry Dunn. I remember well when he was talking outside the court, like, I mean, you think we were bad, wait till you see what's coming down the road. And he was absolutely correct in what he was saying, like, I mean, because we knew the Duns, like, I mean, the Duns were sort of high-class criminals, you know, they considered themselves top of the table. And Christie and Henry and Larry and all of them, you know, they were more sort of gentlemen criminals. They regarded themselves as that, even though they weren't.
Yeah.
But that's the way they regarded themselves. But they, again, like everything else, they started dabbling in drugs, and a lot of the
there was less of them.
Come to that.
There was less of them. I don't mean as a family, the Duns, but in general, criminals and sort of, you know, high-ranking criminals. There was less to feed off before cocaine.
Oh yeah, like, I mean, well, in the Duns' time, it was cannabis and heroin, and they really introduced heroin into the Dublin scene. That's where, you know, they flooded the Dublin scene with heroin back in the early
and I suppose there was
80s, 90s.
A finite amount of customers they could ever get from heroin, whereas with cocaine, there was the customers plus there was all these users at the weekend.
Yes, and in that particular time, there was very few people who could afford cocaine. You could afford heroin, but you couldn't afford cocaine unless you were fairly wealthy. And it was more the upper class people, like, I mean, business people. I won't go into anything other than that for save. But there was high class people who were involved in the use of cocaine back in those days.
So sort of 2002 to 2006/7 when you retired. So you're in the district where Marlo is growing, and like we say Marlo, when we only refer to them by their first name, it shows their fame, doesn't it, in gangland terms?
Yeah.
So,
and his name wasn't Marlo, it was Martin.
Martin, exactly. So was he constantly in the ether?
He was constantly to the forefront in our view as the Manses. Like, I mean, we were looking at him, like, I mean, it's like everything else. Unfortunately, in the K district, where what we're referring to is Blanchardstown, Finglas and Campbell, like, I mean, Marlo was one person. He was probably the biggest person, but there was so many others that were drawing us away from him at the time, like, I mean, who were just as evil, probably more evil than Marlo, and more engaged in madness and everything else like that, particularly in the Finglas area.
Yeah.
We were dealing with an awful lot of criminals there. And we'd several murders in that area at that time.
Do you know, it's interesting actually, if you look at when Marlo got that paranoid, and some of his own people he took out was a guy, Coddington and Ray. I don't know if you remember them. They were in Meath.
That's right.
But the knock-on effect of their murders,
yes,
led to the Price Maguire organisation forming in Drogheda, Louth, growing, and obviously all that went on.
You look then and you see what happened there. You know, like, I mean, everything has a sort of a knock-on reality, like, I mean, that comes afterwards.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, you had Marlo, and then you had Eamon Dunn, and now you had Fishy Fitzgerald and all of these guys, like, I mean, and now you have, you've
Flashy Gang and
the Flashy Gang and all of that, like, I mean, who are now there, like, I mean, and in between that, you'd Eamon Daly, and so, like, I mean, you know, when you consider it and think about it, and then up in Blanchardstown, like, I mean, you had the Gouldings, you had the remnants of the M50 crew, as we called it. Like. So, you know, we were dealing with all of those, like, I mean, and they were attempting to kill each other all the time. It was just mayhem.
And, like, you're working in it 7 days a week at the time. You said 14-hour days, just crazy stuff. You know, having had time to look back on it and consider it, have you any thoughts on why people choose that life?
Good question. I think from the very young age, I wanted to be a guard. And I don't know why, really, because we used to play out on the street in Drumcondra there, like, I mean, and you'd see a guard coming up Botanic Avenue on a bike, and you'd run. And you would have done absolutely nothing wrong with the sight of a uniform in those days. You would literally run up and hide in case he thought you had done something.
Yeah.
That's how crazy it was. And I always got a feeling about that. And I said, what a wonderful, how would you say, like, I mean, that he had so much power.
An air
about him. Yeah. Exactly. And I always said, I'd love to get in. But when I did join then in 1971, it was completely different. Like, I mean, times had changed, obviously. They were moving on, and I joined, and my first station was Kilmainham, and you had a lot of deprivation in that area. Like, I mean, you had Fatima Mansions and Dolphin House, like, before they were rejuvenated and that, like, I mean, Keogh Square, which then went into St. Michael's Estate, you had the lower part of Ballyfermot, and it was a huge district. But in that area, like, I mean, you had a lot of people who weren't well off, and you had a lot of city crime, like, I mean, you know, more aggression than anything else, like, because they didn't know how to deal with the poverty, like, I mean, you know, and you had a lot of violence in the houses, in the homes as well, like, I mean, and that was very hard at times, like, I mean, you go up and be dealing with a man who was after nearly half killing his wife, like, I mean, and, you know, and you'd be taking him out, and then she'd appear in the court next morning and say, he's not too bad when he's sober, and, you know, and I know, like, I mean, but that was her life, and that was the times that they lived in, and so you could sort of understand these things. If he wasn't there and he wasn't earning a few bob, they had nothing. You know, that was the other side of it, you know. You could have a woman there who would be prepared to put up with that type of thing. Yeah. Which is sad.
And I suppose a lot of those sort of early criminals stole and stuff like that because they were hungry.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, like, I mean, a lot of them stole to feed the family. And, you know, we all knew that. Like, I mean, and sure, we often caught the younger lads, like, I mean, stealing and that, like, I mean, and when in those days, you used to give them a clipper in the ear, like, I mean, and it was acceptable. Yeah. It's not acceptable now, and it certainly wouldn't be acceptable. But in those particular days, it was. And you'd send them home, and you probably mightn't take the stuff off them even, like, you know, because you knew where it was going. Yeah. You know, and how would you say, the word discretion comes into it. big time. And you'd stop a man on the road, driving a car, and his tax might be out 3 months or something like that. And he'd tell you, look, I was out of work there for the last 6 months. I'm after getting a job on a site. And if you give me a chance, I'll produce the tax to you in another couple of weeks if you give me a chance. And you give him a chance.
Yeah.
And of course he would. The man would turn up. 9 times out of 10, the man would turn up with tax in his car. And, you do that because you didn't want to be.
What changed then in the decades, do you think, until we came along and we had the likes?
Changed. I remember, it was very simple when I joined. The times were very simple. You had a lot of serious crime going on, but it wasn't. It was Sarah and those type of people that were robbing banks and post offices and that. And that was far removed from where I was at the time, a uniformed guard doing the beat and then on the patrol car. But what I did notice, with the upsurge of crime in the IRA starting up the north, what you did see was a lot of the more senior lads who were on your unit disappearing and going into various jobs, special branch, forensics, fingerprints, ballistics, all of those jobs needed more manpower, and they were trained up and went up into these jobs, which then gradually reduced the strength of the units and reduced so that you were, the thoughts of me getting out in a car as a young student, or not as a student guard, but as a young guard with 2 years experience. I was out, it started off, I was doing observer in the car, and the next thing is I'm driving the car.
Right.
That, was never heard of at that particular time. But this was the quick advance of everything that was happening in Ireland at that particular time. So you went, in a very quick period of time, you went from a relatively simple type of lifestyle to a very dangerous type of lifestyle, where you had armed robberies going on practically all over the country, big fellas driving into towns and taking over the town, robbing the bank, and then driving out of town, and this type of carry on, all done by INLA, and and then you had to set up, of the Guard armed. They weren't an armed response unit. They were emergency response unit. There was another unit then that was set up with the special branch, and they were an armed unit that was going around the whole country at the time. Trying to catch these people. But they were the type of days. And then you had the introduction of the Duns then in the early 70s. And the crimes that they were committing armed robberies. They started off we were going out and robbing cars out at Glencree and places like that, where during the summer, that was their bread and butter stuff, years, and then they developed up from that, they saw that there was money to be made in drugs, and they started selling drugs. And they started utilising people in Dolphin House and Fatima Mansions and Rialto. And
these people who had nothing.
People who had
the
nothing,
next generation.
Yeah, and they were using them, as their foot soldiers, to sell the drugs and that. And then, of course, those places became absolutely saturated with people hung out on drugs,
using and selling,
spread all over the city, like wildfire, So
everything's just changed so quickly then.
Everything, absolutely, but you were there, you could see it evolving, and the guards had to evolve with that, for years we had the Guard of Síochána had been very sort of slow to move. I remember back in the early 80s, we had the guards, we had a meeting in the Garda Club in Arlington Street, and the detectives, we wanted to be armed, because we were going out and we were carrying out searches unarmed, where we could meet up with armed people. We were going on patrols where we could meet up with armed people, and we were going searches, all of these type of things. So our lives were in danger. There's no point in saying they weren't. But I remember a certain, I won't mention his name, but he was a certain chief superintendent who came up to the meeting and he said, we didn't have anything to worry about because the criminals knew the difference between special branch and ordinary detectives.
Oh, right, and they weren't going.
And even though you were in plainclothes, they knew the difference.
Right.
Like, I mean, that was the type of mentality that you had in the job at the time, you know, and higher echelons. So, like, I mean, but it took a while, but then you got, like, I mean, I worked with some great people down through the years, like, I mean, and I worked with a number of the commissioners, like, I mean, and that, like, I mean, in my, you know, as to say, as I worked along, and they were great people and very, very, very good, you know, detectives and that sort of stuff, like, I mean, so I had a great experience in life, like, I mean, working with these people.
So while things were changing a lot, I suppose, when we hit the 2000 and into the era of Marlo.
Yes.
They're just changing unrecognisably, I presume.
Completely. You were really into the
cocaine
business
times,
at that particular time. Like, I mean, large consignments of cocaine were flooding Ireland at that particular time. And practically every district in Dublin set up a local drug unit, a small little drug unit. And we manned them with young, enthusiastic guards, both male and female, like, I mean, and they were fantastic. They did terrific work, like, I mean, in you know, following the trails of where these drugs were coming in and who was having them and where they were being sold and where they were being stashed and all that, and dealers and that type of thing, like, I mean, so there was great work done, but always, like, I mean, the main persons were able to shake their hands, like, I mean, and, you know, off these things. They were never physically touching them.
Of course not, yeah.
So, like, I mean, the other people who did the work for them on that side, you know, because...
And Marlo, I suppose, benefited from all those other things you said were going on. There was other murders and the district was very busy, and he benefited from what resources there were being sucked away from him and towards other...
Oh, absolutely. Like, I mean... You see, like, I mean, and you often have to consider the fact, like, I mean, that, you know, a lot of these people that were involved in major serious crime in the other area, in our area, like in particular, were, you know, as a result of what was going on with Marlo and that type of thing, like, I mean, he was sort of, you know, putting them against each other. And so, like, I mean, you had... gangs fighting each other, like, I mean, in areas and that sort of stuff.
Did you get an insight into his personality?
He was one, like, I mean, he never showed affluence, if you want, you know, like, I mean, he always remained in his own background, like, I mean, in Carberin and Finglas, like, I mean, where the places where he lived, he never showed any affluence as such, like, even down to cars he was driving or motorbikes or anything like that. He was, you know, you didn't go, like, I mean, Gilligan's. Like, Gilligan was the kingpin who went and built mansions and wanted to run horses and everything else like that, you know. But no, he wasn't that type. He was more stay down, low-key level, where you'd stay in your own area where you controlled everything and you were able to, everyone was looking out for you and everyone was watching what the guards were doing and, you know, would report back to him as quick as, you know, so that he could keep that one step ahead of him.
So you would think that what was his lure was the power rather than the money? The
power, yes. Money, of course, like, I mean, obviously, like, I mean, money was there, like, I mean, and you're talking about vast amount of money. And, like, I mean, he had houses bought, like, I mean, in relatives' names and all that sort of stuff, like, I mean, particularly at the time of his murder, he was housing Duchy Hyland. Like, I mean, he had actually brought in Hyland, who had only got out of prison at the time. He brought in Duchy as, I think he brought him in more as a scare to try and scare off any would-be assassins, you know, because he was paranoid that
in the run-up to his death, he was moving around.
He was moving around. Like, he wasn't just staying in the niece's house all the time. Like, I mean, he was moving between girlfriends and he was friends' houses and that type of thing. But he did spend quite considerable time in the niece's house, which was only a new house that had been built in Scribblestown. And he was there, he was occupying the box bedroom up there. And, you know, he felt safe there. And then, of course, like, I mean, he'd his henchmen calling up to see him every day, like, I mean, and including Dutchy and that, like, I mean. And Dutchy, as you're probably well aware, like, I mean, was suspect for Veronica Guerin's murder, like, I mean, and
the gunman
for that. And he was also, like, I mean, you know, as a very dangerous individual, like, I mean, and there was very few people would cross him. So having him on your side was sort of an additional piece of insurance, or he, at least Marlo, felt that.
At that point.
You know.
So were you working that day in December?
Yes, I was actually. I was working. I was up in Blanchardstown Station that morning, and I remember it vividly. I remember getting the call. There was a shooting down in Scribblestown, and, you know, I was coming back to, you know, like, I mean, on phone and that, like, I mean, that I was coming back in, like, I mean, that there was two people shot dead. And then you got the word, like, I mean, there was Marlo Hyland and a young lad, a young plumber.
You heard that before you even got there?
No, like, I mean, even as I was on my way, we were getting information. Like, I mean, I went down with the local superintendent at the time. I brought him down in my car. We drove straight to the scene, like, I mean, and we arrived there, I'd say, less than 15 minutes or so after it happened, like, you know. But it was amazing the amount of guards who had arrived, you know, and from different areas, you know, like, I mean, different groupings and detective units and that, like, I mean, who had arrived on the scene. Place was being preserved. And, you know, the ballistics and forensic people arrived fairly quickly. You know, very quickly. And I wouldn't, you know, like, I mean, I made a decision, don't let anyone else into the house now until they arrive and go through it, because at that stage, there had been a few people into the house, like, I mean, you know, and we had to take their fingerprints, shoes, everything else like that, and, you know, for trace evidence and that. So the less they moved around in the house, the better. And that was including myself. And
from a practical point of view, it's a very quick response. It's a very quickly shut down crime scene which is, this isn't a drive-by shooting. So, you know, from the obvious evidence to hand and the two victims that these gunmen have travelled through the house, one or both. So there's probably a lot to be garnered from that crime scene.
What would have been, and, like, I mean, but it was amazing, like, I mean, there was very little.
Right.
Believe it or not, there was very little forensic evidence recovered at the scene. We got the shell casing of the firearm that was used. So we would have been able to trace it back to the firearm if we were recovering the firearm. Marlo, as I was upstairs in the box room, and I went up to see him, and I waited until the forensic came in, and the forensic put down the various foot things like we could stand on, plates that we could stand on. And I remember going up to see him, and he was lying on his side. And immediately you could see, like, I mean, he had 2 holes just at the back of his ear, left ear, and he also had, what do you call it, a number of, he'd been shot 6 times. He'd been shot in the back as well. And as I said, he was holding his scapulars when I went in.
So you think he woke?
Oh, he was wide awake, like, I mean, because all happened within a very short period of time. David Murphy, the plumber, had arrived with Anthony Campbell, and they had gone into the house when Elaine, his niece, Marlo's niece, was there, and she was going to bring a child to school, and she brought her younger child with her. But before she went up and she gave Marlo Hyland a number of Solfidine and a drink. And she'd been talking when she told him that the plumbers were downstairs and that they might want to come into the room because they were looking at the radiators. The central heating wasn't working properly. And so she told him like that. Then she headed off, and that would have been around 9 o'clock. At 9:18, the plumber is David Murphy, who had left the house, was buying, because we knew from the receipt, in the shop that he was down in Finglas, he was buying plumbing equipment, and he arrived back to the house at 9, and we have him ringing Anthony at 9:28 because he couldn't get an answer at the door. So you're talking about a 10-minute period there. And our honest belief is that this happened shortly after Elaine left and David Murphy left. And once David left the house, the people who were waiting to come in saw him. They didn't see or didn't know, that Anthony was in the house.
You don't think they saw two go in?
I don't believe they saw that, because they saw the van, but they probably didn't see the passenger getting out as well as the driver and going into the house.
Mm.
And when they went in, the first thing they saw was Anthony on his hands and knees down at the radiator in the front room. And we believe, that they held him, one of them stayed there and held him there first.
Mm.
Didn't shoot him or anything like that. They went upstairs and they fired and they murdered Marlo in his bed. And then they came down. I don't believe they were masked, because from descriptions of some of the witnesses that gave us descriptions on that, they didn't appear to be masked. They weren't particularly worried. But I have a sense that they knew Anthony from the inner city, and that Anthony knew them and probably knew them from the inner city and from hanging around and that sort of thing. And that's probably the reason I believe that they, or that, or you could say, they knew that he'd be able to identify them, at least. But we think it was more than that. But that's when they decided to shoot him.
Was the same gun used?
Same gun was used.
So the same gunman shot both?
Yeah.
Do you think there was a discussion?
Hopefully not. I hope to God there wasn't, because, young Anthony was just left on the ground, and as I said to you, he was a young man, he was 20 years of age, but he certainly didn't look 20. When I saw him, he looked like a young lad of 15, just lying curled on the ground, and you could see where the bullet had gone through his hand, where he obviously put his hand up to try and protect himself or shield himself from what was coming. So it was a tough scene.
And outside the crime scene, so sorry, one thing I wanted to ask you was there carpet in the house?
Not to my recollection. It was more wooden floors, that type of thing.
Which is probably more difficult to get forensics from, is it?
Yeah.
And
the only thing is, if you had walked in dirt or walked in dust or that, and walked on it, you would leave probably an imprint of a shoe or whatever like that, and
Yeah.
So you'd be looking for and the forensics people would be well able to, with dust and everything else like that, to bring up the likes of that.
And we have this impression probably from crime dramas on the television, but that we leave DNA everywhere we go, that we,
that we shed.
That we shed. And so somebody stood over the top of Marlo Hyland in the bed for, presumably it takes a few seconds anyway to release 6 bullets from a gun into him, and there would have been blood and possibly from the gun going off, there might have been some movement of the person, but was there anything around the bed or anything? No.
Strange enough, no. And the type of guns they were using were 9mm handguns, and they don't recoil that very heavily in your hand compared to a revolver type of a weapon. The 9mm will, there will be a recoil from it, but it was the gun, the shots were fired at very close range. So, like, I mean, if we had got those people immediately after the robbery or the shooting after, you would have a gunshot residue on them and all that type of thing. So, like, I mean, the place was, like, when even the fire brigade, when they went in, like, I mean, to check the bodies and that, like, for life, when they went in, you could smell the cordite in the room, like, I mean, in Marlo, where Marlo was shot dead, you could smell the gunpowder, and that was a while after it. And you would expect, if you got them with their clothes or anything like that,
if you had
you'd have residue
got them
on them, like, you know.
And what about the door handle?
Door handle, nothing.
The door was open, or ajar.
Or else they knocked and young Campbell answered the door and they walked in.
And the door into Marlo's room was left ajar.
That was open anyway. Like, I mean, and, you know, there was a full, and I mean a very, very thorough complete examination of the scene, as I would expect, you know, and I wouldn't expect any less from the people. But I knew they were experts in their field, and I was happy with what they, you know, like, I mean, the work that they carried out.
And I suppose the hitmen were experts in their field too, and they had well planned and knew not to be putting a bare hand on banisters. Or was there a suspicion that they had gloves and maybe something over their feet?
It's quite possible. Like, I mean, but I don't think they would have resorted to that. Like, I mean, I know that certain items were bought before. Certain items of clothing and footwear were bought before the murder. And that's how far we were able to bring that. We know, like, I mean, who bought them, and, you know, they were never recovered.
And how quickly did you identify the suspects?
Practically immediately.
How?
Well, following the robbery, 2 cars were seen. The car that was used, like, I mean, in the murder, and a car was following it. And the second car that was following the VW Passat, black VW Passat was used. And you had a second car then that was following that. The VW Passat was burnt out. That was driven down to just off Ballygall Road East. You had a little laneway there which ran between Ballygall Road East down near there's an old folks' flats there, and it used to be you could walk through it and drive through it at one stage. Even though there was bollards there, you could still drive through. But that particular morning that it was there, like, I mean, there was a steel shed, a workman's shed, like, I mean, from the corporation or council, and they were doing work in the lane and work on houses nearby. So they couldn't actually drive the whole way through, like, I mean, but that led out from Ballygall Road East into Glassanane Estate, Glassanane Avenue, which is just behind. And the car was set alight there, like, I mean, and again, like, I mean, the car didn't exactly burn to a cinder either, like, I mean, so there was, you know, forensics examination of that as well.
3 people in total?
I believe there's 3, possibly 4 even.
Yeah, possibly another driver of one of those cars, unidentified. And, you know, Eamon the Don Dunn, even back then, was a fairly recognisable face in that area.
He was very, very recognisable, and that was really at the beginning of his, how would you say, coming of age in criminality, like, I mean, in the area. Like, I mean, he was beginning to rise into notoriety. Like, I mean, he was there. So, like, I mean, he would have had visions probably of taking over Marlo's business.
And did,
as we know. Did
witnesses in the area, were they immediately terrified? Because this is like, okay, you've got 2 things going on in this murder. It's not a standard sort of gangland murder, because you have Marlo Hyland dead, but you have this innocent child almost dead as well, young adult. Did it change the kind of the usual way that people came forward with information? Were they more forthcoming, or were they still afraid? Because
they were very afraid. And it was always like, I mean, I remember, like, I mean, I went to several murders in Finglas, and the outskirts of Finglas as well. And we'd always do house to house. Like, I mean, that was a matter of, you know, priority, that you would do it as quick as you could.
Yeah.
because you might get someone then who would say something to you. Like, I mean, they mightn't say it to you, at the door, but they say, look, I'll drop down and see you, or something like that. Like, and we'd ask them to do that. Because I remember the last murder I was at Finglas, it was on a Sunday morning, and I was up at Ratoath Road and Ratoath Avenue. And I seen two fairly notable criminals there, and they were just looking down the street, and they were just giving the hand across the throat sign down to anyone who was there. Like, I mean, it was, in other words, keep quiet, don't open, don't say anything to the guards. Like, I mean, and that was the type of thing that you had in the Finglas area. Like, I mean, at that particular time. Mm. You had a lot of major criminals residing in the area. Mm. And people were actually quite terrified because there had been a lot of murders in the Finglas area. Mm-hmm. And they didn't want to be the next one, People were being intimidated. Any witnesses we ever got in Finglas were intimidated. Same in Blanchardstown, and...
Would there be people now who wouldn't be so scared?
Well, I always said, and I always maintained, that whatever went around comes around. And, I'd be a firm believer now, like, I mean, that this is a case actually that could still be solved. And it could be solved by witnesses coming forward, by talking to people, talking to other criminals. And because a lot of the people who created that fear in the area at that particular time are now gone. Mm. They're a lot older. Their status as major criminals would no longer, be there, like, I mean, to affect any potential witnesses or anything like that. And, people have consciences, and you would sort of hope, like, I mean, that their conscience would eventually help them to come and say, look, I did see this, I did see who did it, I did see the people who did this, I know them.
And so many years later, their statements are still very valid.
Absolutely, yes. People sort of see things, like, I mean, and they see them sort of like as if watching a picture. And it embeds itself in their memories. Like, I mean, I know, like, I mean, that was embedded in my memory. Mm. So if you're talking about me as a sort of so-called seasoned hard detective, like, I mean, you're talking about people, just ordinary working class people who were there. So you can imagine what that was doing to them. To be embedded visibly on their brains, like, I mean, so that they'd be recalling it for a long, long time. Mm. Certainly, like, I mean, I know there's people out there who know an awful lot more than what they told us, even including associates of Marlo who were called to the house that morning, and who were so-called great friends of his and that, like, I mean, the amount of work that went into it was just incredible. Like, I mean, we didn't leave any stone, and I'm happy we didn't leave any stone unturned. Like, I mean, and when I left, it was one murder of you've murders that I had, like, I mean, that we didn't solve, obviously, but none of them, like, I mean, affected me like this one. Mm. So this was one that we wanted to solve, because I remember meeting Anthony's mother, Christine, and his father, Noel, and and I remember meeting other members of the family and that, like, and telling them how we were going. Like, I mean, we didn't hide anything from them. Like, I mean, we told them where we were, told them the difficulties we were having, and we were having difficulties. There's no point in saying we weren't. And to try and get a conviction, like, I mean, we could go so far with them.
Was there a huge amount of pressure? I mean, the publicity around the case was so huge, the innocent victim.
Well, I know, like, I mean, obviously, like, I mean, we had a lot of pressure from my authorities, like, I mean, at the time. But, like, I mean, and rightly so, probably, like, I mean, because everyone wanted to solve this case. And, like, I mean, we had regular meetings with the Assistant Commissioner, who was Martin Highland at the time, Noel White, who was the Detective Chief Superintendent in the NBCI. We had certain You know, we had people from the NBCI giving us assistance for a short period of time, but then they were, like everything else, they were dragged away for other crimes. You know, like, I mean, so we were back down to our own resources, like, I mean, which were limited, and I mean limited, like, you know, but on top of that, you say, like, I mean, you know, like, I mean, I could have 3 or 4 murders going on at the one time. I know that sounds crazy. I was in Blanchardstown, Finglas, from 2002 to 2007. I had 19 murders. I had about 20 or 30 attempted murders. I had shootings. I had bombings. I had major drugs problems. I had rapes. I had major burglaries. You know, you've all your other crime that you've there as well, like, I mean, that you have to do. And you've your small core unit. And those people were great. But they were being flogged to death with all the work that they had to do. Like, I mean, it was just incredible work and incredible work that they did do. They never flagged on it, which was fantastic, like, you know, and, you know.
It sounds to me that the investigation, the nuts and bolts of it, it will, you know, stand in the same way as in the recent conviction of Noel Long for the murder of Nora Sheehan. That original investigation was robust, it was really good. There was just, you know...
just lack of the final...
There was, in that case,
piece of evidence
there was
you need.
A couple of people had died and all. Anyway, so it's solved, and both the Forensic Ireland and the detectives that originally were on it did nothing wrong. And that's what stood to that case and got it through at the final hurdle, which may have come 40 odd years later, but nonetheless it did.
It did.
And it feels to me as if this investigation is similar.
I would certainly hope so. It can be solved. It's very, very close. Even to this day, it's very close. It doesn't need an awful lot extra. It needs just a little bit of help from the public.
Yeah.
To do it, you know, and clear it.
And Christine Campbell questions, why can this not be reviewed, this case?
Yeah, I've often asked that question as well.
From the nature of the 2 suspects and what you know of them, do you think this sits badly with them, what they did that day?
Well, I think it has to sit badly with them. Whatever about murdering Marlo, certainly killing the innocent young lad, that has to sit with them. You know, and I'd say that was probably done out of fear more than anything else, that they would be identified, that he'd be capable of identifying them. And that's not the type of murder that you do. If you're going in, like, I mean, these were seasoned criminals. Like, I mean, they were going in to carry out a hit on Marlo Hyland. That was, you know, that was their plan. And, you know, they certainly weren't going in to murder young Anthony Campbell, you know.
Do people who choose and make money from a life like that feel remorse?
Some do, some don't. I've often met fellas afterwards, even since I retired. You know, I've met people to come up on the street, like, I mean, and it was only recently I was in a petrol garage car getting petrol, and this fella came up and I was in the queue, like, I mean, he says, "We know you." As soon as he said it, I looked around and I saw his, and I turned to him, "I know you too." You know, the one thing you certainly don't do is you don't show fear or anything like that. You can't, like, I mean, you know, like, I mean, the amount of times you're threatened as you go down to 36 years in the police, you're going to, you deal with it. It becomes part and parcel of what you're dealing with. But he, like, I mean, this fella, like, I mean, I knew what he had done. He had done some fairly serious stuff as well, like, you know. And he says, "I've gone clean now, Mr. Sherry." He says, I really have. He says, "I've gone clean now and I'm sorted my life out, like, you know."
She said to him, "About time."
I said, "Man, delighted to hear that." I said, "You know, make sure you keep it up that way, you know."
Yeah, yeah.
At least you're doing the effort, you know. And I was, you know, and he had, outside he had a lovely, fairly newish van there, and a young lad working with him, like, I mean, so I'd say that they were doing removals and that type of thing, like, you know, but at least it was honest work.
People change.
People do change, you know.
The witnesses you're talking about that are vital, perhaps, to this case, are they eyewitnesses who saw cars, or are they more sort of intimate witnesses?
Both. Visited every house in the estate, and also houses on the road, like in the Tolka Valley Road, you know, just across the road from Scribblestown. And we got some witnesses there. But we also got one witness in Scribblestown who actually said that they heard the shots. And no one else heard them.
Right.
So you ask yourself why. Because if you hear shots in Finglas, you look out and see what's going on. Because, you know, it's your natural instinct to look. And when you look, you see things. You know, so there's no doubt in my mind that there are people there who decided to say nothing because they were fearful. They knew who Martin Highland was. So if he was murdered, the people who murdered him were serious criminals.
Yeah.
And the likelihood was that their lives would be in danger if they said something. It wasn't anything to do with young Anthony Campbell.
Yeah.
It was more Marlo Hyland that had them terrified.
Of course.
But if they were prepared as well to murder an innocent child, then
what types were
what were they going to do if you had them, you know, making a statement and going as a witness into the court or something like that and giving evidence in an open court, like, I mean, that the intimidation that those people would have been under, like, I mean, would have been colossal, you know, and I know that.
So are you surprised to be sitting here today talking about this?
I am actually, yeah. Like, I mean, it's a case, like, I mean, that's never gone away, though. And it's one of those cases that won't go away.
We need to try again.
I think so, yeah. I honestly believe, yeah. I'd love to go back again, just for that case.
Right.
And I'm 18 years retired now.
Right.
So.
It's the one.
Oh, it's the one.
I'm Nicola Talent, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.